This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, welcome back to another edition of Video Learning with Region 8. My name is Josh Winning. I'm the Executive Director here. Joining me today, my colleague Cindy McKinney with our presenter Mike Gorman. And the topic today is asking the right question, QFT, Question Formulation Technique, Part 1. And this is a really interesting technique and approach to engaging student inquiry processes that's been led by the Right Question Institute. And Mr. Gorman has had a lot of experience working with this, and we're really excited to learn about helping our teachers know how to better engage students and help them ask the right questions and engage at a deeper level with their learning processes. As always, I want to make sure that folks are aware we are pleased to be sponsored by and supported by the generous contributions of the Schwab Foundation. And we're excited here at Region 8 to be a part of that process with our Makerspace and Ask teams. And again, you can learn more about what we're going to be seeing today here at indianamakerspace.weebly.com, as well as the Region 8 website at r8esc.k12.in.us. So thanks again for joining us today. And Mr. Gorman, welcome. And before we get started there, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Cindy, to get us started here on your end. Welcome, Cindy and Mike. And Mike and Cindy, what do you have on tap for us today?
Well, I'm just excited that there's a second part to this, because I think that means that we're going to have great information today and more great information down the road. So Mike, tell us a little bit more about the right questions.
Okay, well, let's take a look at this whole thing, because I know one of the things that I think one of the things when we want to get students to take ownership of their learning is we need to activate their inquiry, which is so important for our students. If we don't do that, they're not owning it. And so here's my thought here. Albert Einstein said, the only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. Any thoughts, Cindy and Josh, as you see that? Anything you guys think about when you look at that quote?
I think that it's my experience. Of course, I've been out of the organized education world for a while, but it certainly reminds me a lot of what sometimes we think is helpful for kids ends up actually complicating their learning.
Josh, anything?
Yeah, probably sometimes as well-intentioned processes and what we think is good pedagogy can sometimes be stifling creative thought or stifling thinking in an organized and structured education process. Is kind of how I would think about that.
Yeah, and so as we look at that, so many times our best intentions don't always, I'm sure there are times that teachers out there, you've said, wow, this is such a great question or such a whatever, but the kids didn't seem involved in it. And possibly part of that is because they weren't owning the learning as they did that. So one of the things that I want to talk about in this webinar and in our next one is actually promoting the question, because education really is all about questions. And as you look at it, think about a child growing up. They learn from their environment. We don't have some prescribed teaching program that says, oh, it's now time for talking and we're going to teach you how to talk. And if we did that type of stuff, we're suddenly going to have the slow talkers, the fast talkers, the gifted talkers, all this type of thing. And so little kids and babies, they learn from their environment and they start asking questions. And that's the whole learning process that happens. Now, what's interesting is we keep on going through this whole process. What happens is our kids suddenly, as they start going through school, if anybody's taught kindergarten, they're all asking questions. First grade, they're asking questions. Somewhere along the line, they learn, be quiet, don't ask questions because the teacher has everything to say. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we promote inquiry? How do we promote this whole question process with our students in order to engage learning. And I think this is especially important in the blended learning environment as we go online. And one of the things I'm going to do in part 2 of this whole series is I'm going to talk about how do we do this online. So I'm going to go over the why, and we've kind of already done that a little bit. The what is it, and then how do we do it? And that's going to be the basis of today. Then we'll get into in part 2 of some actual, what are some resources, what are some ways that I can do this in an e-learning process. But I think it's really important to know the process first. And so why do we want to promote inquiry and questioning? First of all, it fits right into STEM and makers, and I will also say it's part of the PBL process. It promotes student engagement. It promotes and makes the ownership of the inquiry. Suddenly the students own the inquiry. We have the connections. We can do this with every subject. We can do it in social studies. We can do it in art. We can do it in music. And it honors questioning, which is so important, especially if we're going to have the democracy we want to have. And so as we get into this, let me get into this whole idea of STEM and makers. One of the things we really talk about is the design process put out by Spark Lab at the Lemelson Center and the Smithsonian Institute. And that process actually looks a little bit like that. As we start going into the design process, we think it, we explore it, we sketch it, we create it, we try it, we tweak it, we sell it. And a part of every one of these steps is inquiry, answering, and then even coming up with new questions. So the whole inquiry process is part of the design process. We could keep on going, and science teachers, you know that inquiry is huge in the scientific method. We need to ask questions. We need to do a hypothesis, and then as we experiment, part of our analysis is actually questioning again to see how things worked. Or we could look at it from a social studies standpoint. Are things historically accurate and culturally sensitive? And what type of questions do we have about our history, the world history, all these types of things, which seems to be a very prominent issue in today's society. We can also get into the idea of research, writing, and process. And we hope that kids are not just copying and pasting from websites and putting things in their research papers, but that they're using inquiry, because it's only through inquiry that we learn how to do a proper Google search. Okay, we ask the questions, we try to think of those things. If we don't even understand the question, I'm not sure how you get the answer. And that is so important. This was a Stanford History Education Group research study, and it actually talked about how there's this automatic assumption that because kids are great with technology, they have this automatic awareness and they're fluent in knowing how to find answers and actually critique websites, things like that. And they actually found out that this is not true. And actually, I think this end one is really, really important. It says, the authors worry that democracy is threatened by the ease at which disinformation about civic issues is allowed to spread and flourish. And this was done back in 2015, and it's so relevant today. So as we keep on going let's take a look at some studies that have been done, both, and I have the sources down there for you. But we can see that at our bottom graph is age, and at the side is percentages. And this is how reading skills and writing skills proceed through schooling, okay, from age 1 all the way up to 18. And as you look at that, you can see that we have a strong boost in reading. And in fact, look what happens there, especially after about in between 5th grade and 9th grade. That is where we have a lot of kids reading and reading skills improving. I think it goes up after that, but maybe we don't have a strong enough emphasis on reading in high school. Now take a look at the writing process, and you can see we've suddenly shifted a little bit from reading to now trying to get kids to produce the information. And you can see how that goes up really after that freshman year of high school, and then levels off as we get into college, because hopefully we've come fairly proficient at that. Although in some ways we're possibly going down a little bit there too. Now this is the important graph I want to show you. Take a look at this, and this is through feedback. This slide is actually, all of these slides were courtesy of the Right Question Institute. But as you look at that, look at this orange line. That's proficiency in asking questions. Look how proficient we are at age 2, and everybody who knows a 2-year-old, boy, they know how to ask questions. And look what happens. It goes up at 5. Look what happens when kids enter school. At 5, it suddenly starts going down. And take a look, by the time they're in middle school, high school, whatever, our actual proficiency in this area of asking questions is not there, and we're not asking as many questions anymore. And if anything, we should be asking more, and our kids should be asking more. So what do students believe? Well, 20% of students believe college taught them to ask their own questions. Only 27%. And we can see that in the high school and middle school, we can see where the decline started, okay, which I think, again, is so, so important. And this was by perceptions of students. Now, as we go on, we need our kids to own the inquiry. That is so, so, so important. Our kids need to own this. We just can't. I know so many of you, you will sit there and you will ask a question. And there are a couple things that I see happen in my observations. Sometimes the teacher doesn't even have the wait time for the kids to process the question. So wait time's important. Another thing I see when I observe classes, it's the same 2 or 3 kids asking all the question, and I'm not sure what the other kids are doing, okay? Which is so, 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 so important. But if we get our kids to own these questions, that's what's important, and that's what we're going to be going over today. So here's another one, and Lord Alexander said, we learn more by looking for the answer to a question and not finding it than we do from learning the answer itself. And when you think about your own learning, that's so many times I'm in schools today and they say, we need to promote rigor. Well, guess what? Here's rigor right here. If we're giving our kids the answer, because that's by the time they're in high school, college, they've been trained to hear the answer. And all they're doing is looking for the answer because the teacher's going to have the answer. Why? We've programmed that for them. We've programmed that since kindergarten. But if we make them struggle to find their own questions and answer their own answers, now we actually have turned on the engagement, and we're actually, they're now in the learning process. They're not just receiving the information. So if you're in the chat room, feel free to throw in any questions on what we've talked about so far. Cindy and Josh, you're online live with me. What types of thoughts do you have any types of questions or any types of reflections you have as we just got into this first part?
So I feel like when you teach kids to question, you are teaching them to think, because a question that they ask is a reflection of what they're thinking, right? So many times as students age through into middle school and high school, teachers will say, well, they're just not thinking. Well, they're not thinking, again, because we're not asking them to think. And how do we know what they're thinking? Well, we can learn a lot by the types of questions they're asking us. So I would equate this with teaching them how to think.
I think that is, and basically getting that brain going, getting them involved in that process, involved in their own learning, is that teaching them how to think. So you are so right. Laura actually says here online, she says, this is great because you can't Google a question. So many times kids, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, what can you Google and what can't you Google, which is actually the beginning of that research process. I see another comment here that teachers need to be confident enough to say, I don't know, when students ask a question. You know something? When a teacher says, I don't know, the amazing thing about it, that sparks some kids to engagement. Josh, any thoughts?
Yeah, I love the this initial step so far, in that I'm equating this too, as we're trying to teach kids to be entrepreneurial, to be able to think outside the box, to be creative thinkers. What do we see about what successful entrepreneurs do? They ask really good questions. What do people who are solving the problems of today, what do? They are asking great questions, and then they learn from those things and move on. If you watch Shark Tank, what are those sharks doing when they're talking to those prospective entrepreneurs? They're asking them really hard questions that sometimes those people hadn't thought about. So again, that skill set of being able to think of the great question and to question the process and identify the real problem is such a key in so many factors of future success. And so I'm excited to learn more about this and what you have for coming up next, Mike.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you say, Josh, there is so important, because as we learn to ask questions and identify questions, we also learn how to answer them. And I think Chris in the chat room said here, if you're a facilitator, this really works well for you, because you're learning how to create that culture of questioning and inquiry. And we'll have some more workshops as time goes on. This isn't part 2, but on the whole inquiry method, I believe every teacher should have an inquiry wall somewhere in their classroom. But that's time for another webinar. So let's keep on going on here and take a look at the what. Well, we're going to talk about QFT, question formulation technique. And it's from the Right Question Institute. I'm going to talk a little bit about them and how we get this student-owned inquiry. So let's investigate the actual Right Question Institute here. And I've got the link for you there. It will also be in all of your downloaded material at Right Question Institute, or I'm sorry, rightquestion.org. And it's an amazing site. Here's a little screenshot of it. The Right Question Institute, this is kind of amazing. A lot of this question formulation technique did not start in education. It actually started in medicine, which I think is very, very interesting, because what they found out was neither patients nor doctors were asking the right questions. And when you think about that, think about your own experiences, whether it be you in a medical facility or somebody that you're caring for. And so many times you say to yourself, I just walked out of there and I'm not sure I think I understand a thing yet. Part of that is because we weren't formulating the right questions, and the actual medical professions, what they weren't formulating the right questions at us. And so I invite you to go to the site. Now in part 2, we're really going to investigate the site, but there is so many things, like when you see the voter engagement there, there's actually a whole thing on talking about voting engagement here in America, and how to get that going with your kids, your students, social services through this, what a micro democracy is, how you can make this all happen in your schools and families, and of course, how teachers can have that. And one of the cool things they have is even how we can do this online. And that's part of part 2. We'll get with that. But this is the Right Question Institute. Just an amazing place. I have worked with them both out in California with the Buck Institute, and also with Alan November out in Boston. We've worked with them and actually run simultaneous conferences together. So some really great people, some really good stuff. And if you're with us and you want to be part of this in the fall, we're actually going to have some workshops in it, and we're going to give you some free books and things like that, and have some talks, some further talks and investigations, and actually help you write some of these questions and whatever. So let's get into the how, because that's what we're really about. QFT, it's the question formulation technique. There's 5 steps in the method, and it really transfers the inquiry part to students. And so let's take a look here. And our first thing is you individually brainstorm questions on a sheet of paper. You actually show the students an artifact. It could be a picture. It could be a video. It could be a reading. There are all these possible things, but you have to have some type of artifacts. And then you say, what questions do you have as you look at this? Well, guess what? At first, they're going to have a hard time coming up with questions because they're not used to being asked this. As time goes on, they will start, as Chris had said in the chat room, that culture will start to build. So at first, it could be a little bit hard. But guess what I do? I say, tell you what, we are going to assess you on this. I don't care what your questions are, but you're going to hand in 5 questions in the end. Okay? That way you got everybody participating. Okay? And you're not, they're not holding up their hands. They are quietly writing these down on a sheet of paper. And I'm going to run you through the process here in just a second. Well, after they do that, in a group, you share your questions, and then you actually, and I'll talk about this when we get into the process, you actually share your questions, and then you label them as either open or closed questions. And we'll talk about why here in just a second. The next step after that, in a group, you discuss the advantages and disadvantages of an open and closed question. So many times I work with teachers and they can't find the advantage of a closed question because they said it stops inquiry. No, guess what? There are actually advantages to a closed question. Just as we know there's advantages to open, there's also disadvantages to open. And you've seen it in your classrooms. And we'll talk about that in just a second. In a group, you rewrite an open question to a closed question in the group. So now you're collaborating. In fact, all of these have been collaboration except for number 1. Now, it'll be interesting to see how we do this in our classrooms next year. If it's hard to collaborate, that's why part 2 is going to be important for you to watch, because we're going to talk about that. But we rewrite these, and then we look for what insight does that give you. And then last, in a group, you prioritize your top 5 questions. Guess what? You've got them questioning, and you're going to see how this works here in just a second. You've got them questioning. Now they're so excited because they're going to go find the answers. And you're going to see that you're going to want to know the answers after we go through the process here in just a second. So here is the 5 things we just talked about. They're all at the Right Question Institute, and they're all on the resource page that I will give you that's part of this webinar. So let's take a look. I got an artifact for you here. I thought I would bring this up because it is an election year coming up. And as you look at that, let's explore it. Look at the picture, study it carefully. And if you want to participate with me, go ahead and type in the chat room, what questions do you have? As you look at this, what are you thinking? And when I tell this to people, I actually say, really analyze it. Look at faces, look at actions, look at proximities, look at wording, all of these types of things. What types of things do you have? So I'm just going to take about 30 seconds because I hope to see, wow, there, Laura, where are the females? I love it. Barb, I really think that you are so true when you say productive questions are so important for making that culture. Jane said that it is so important for research strategies, and we're going to show you that here in just a second. I think that's interesting there. Josh just said, why are all the adults portrayed as kids?
I have a question.
Yes.
What was happening in 1912 that this might have caused, that caused all of this? What's the 1912 skating pond all about?
There you are. And so what we're doing is we're starting by you guys coming up with the questions. We're already doing what Cindy just said, and that is we're starting to wonder. We're starting to engage. What's happening here? What's going on here? Wow, it's more important than me coming out and saying, let me talk about 1912. Does anybody know what happened in 1912? Oh, nobody knows, so now I'm going to tell you, okay? We're really getting that ownership the other way. I love Jane here just says, is someone on thin ice? So let's keep on going, and we're going to go into this first step. You've already done this. You've individually brainstormed some questions. I threw some up there that I had is, what is the 1912 skating pond? Why are there names on their hats? Who is Miss Democracy? And why the size differences in the individuals? And also, it seems like there's differences between individuals from Miss Democracy, which I think is kind of interesting. So the next step now is we get out of our individual groups and we actually work together, and in a group, we share our questions. We all share our questions. And as we do this, we talk about what is opened and what is closed. Now, this is really powerful because if I just had kids do it on their own, this open and closed, they don't get the feedback from each other. So some of your kids that are struggling with what an open and closed question might be, may do the whole thing wrong and never get that feedback, that formative feedback that they need. So I went through here, and it's kind of hard. That you can be on a fine line. Is this opened and closed? Like, what is a 1912 skating pond? I look at that as kind of open, but because I'm not sure if the pond is actually reflective of what's happening. So it's a little more open than if there truly was something called a 1912 skating pond. Now, to some kids, they may say, what is a 1912 skating pond? And now it's closed. So think about that. Why are there names on the hats? That to me, I think might be more closed. But again, the important thing about this isn't so much that I've labeled them as open and closed. What's important is that we're having discussions on this. Who's Miss Democracy? Closed. And why the size difference and distance between these? And that's more open. Okay. So now as we go on and we look here, the next step is in a group, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of opened and closed questions. So now we're furthering discussion, and I've had really good discussions with teachers on this. And if anybody wants to put in the chat room some of your thoughts, maybe some things that I don't have here, but closed question, an advantage is they have answers. That is awesome. Guess what? How many times have you brought kids to the library or whatever, and they have questions that are open, and to be honest, they're frustrated because they can't find the answers? It really stifles the research process. So that's the good thing. It's okay to have closed questions. So it's easy to research. It's a good start at the researching, but now some things that are disadvantages are they're limiting, they're kind of surface. Actually, as you answer them, you better be fact checking them, because you're actually now answering things that look like they're factual. So what's your fact checking methods, which again is great for the research process. Now, what's the advantages of an open question? Well, they make one think. There's more questions that happen as I sometimes, in fact, this can happen from a close. As I answer it, sometimes I get new questions. I call that spiraling the questions. And usually as we spiral, we get to higher levels and higher levels and higher levels. And they're harder. Laura pointed out earlier that you just can't Google everything. Well, open questions, you can't Google. Guess what? I learned this teaching fourth graders once in reading. One of the questions are, what did you think this character was doing? Why were they doing this in this book? Well, guess what? I can't put in, why do I think whatever into Google. Google's not going to do it. Okay. And so open questions, as soon as kids understand that difference between open and closed questions, what happens is they understand what can be Googled and how to ask that question and what can't be Googled. Now, that's important. Laura says students can really get off track and get to not get to what you're trying to discuss. And that's really important on one of those disadvantages of open, because you sometimes get to that point and suddenly you're way off and you're out of your content area, and you have to constrain that sometimes because they're way off. On other circumstances, sometimes that way off can lead to further questions. Jane says answering multiple closed questions may help answer an open question, and that is so true. and you'll see this as one of our steps that we go on to later that Jane's referring to, because when we prioritize these, we may want to put the closed questions first. Another thing that's good about kids knowing what opened and closed questions are, when they take an AP exam, when they take a standardized test, they can identify the questions, and they know that a closed question is answered differently than an open question. An open question may actually be a multi-step answer. And so it helps them on some of these standardized tests, AP tests, SAT, ACT, all of those types of things. So something to keep in mind, because it really does help. Now, number 4, in a group, and this is where it gets hard, in a group, rewrite an open question to a closed and one of your closed to an open. What insight does it give you? Now, this is important with kids because it gives them the thought process into this question. And my closed was, who is Miss Democracy? My open is, why the interest differences? Why are some of these characters interested in Miss Democracy and some aren't looking at her or aren't quite whatever? I'm wondering, even, it's the first time I saw that, but those ones there have blades down below. Does that mean something? Okay. And so what it does is it actually helps us with a closed question. It can get our kids thinking in a spiral type way of looking deeper once they get the answers. Now, how about the open question? Why the size difference? Why are we having this distance difference and sizing difference? And my closed can actually just be who's closer and who's farther away. Okay. And what that does, it's what Jane had said earlier in the chat room. What happens now is, because we have this open question, by trying to rewrite it as closed, it gives us a research starting point to start answering the open. And so this is really important for kids to understand. And then last, in a group, prioritize your top 5 questions. I just put, why are there names on the hat? Who's Miss Democracy? And notice that now I've been rethinking here. That might be closed, that might be open, but I really tried to get things that were more closed first and then open. And if I suddenly put an open one first, I might say to my students, tell you what, since you have that open, start thinking about closed questions you need to ask in order to answer that. So then you go research. Okay, let's go research. What answers do you find? What new discussions? So I think it's interesting. We just had an Indiana hit here. Steve said Marshall's from Columbia City, and Steve, you're absolutely correct. And kind of interesting, I believe he was on the Democrat ticket there. And so let's take a look here. What new discussions, and Steve just brought up some of these new discussions we just had there in the chat room. And what answers do you find? All these types of things. Now, I'm sure you're engaged now. You're starting to wonder, what's going on here? I bet you some of you have even gone off and Googled because you've wanted to find the answer already, because you're engaged. You've owned the process. Well, let me show you. The next thing I might do with kids, after discussions, after some research, I might show them where I actually pulled this from. And this is actually from the National Archive. And you can see about what's happening. I'm not going to read that all to you, but you can see what's happening, that this was part of the 1912 elections, and this was for the Democratic Convention. And of course, we find out that there is our Indiana person there, who was actually the running mate under Wilson. And so now what we could do, now we're giving them more information, and now we can go through the process again. What new questions do you have? Let's keep on going on this. And guess what? The questioning never ends. Either do the answers, because as we get more answers, we get more questions. So that's the question formation technique. It's online for you at therightquestion.org. I also have it. I point to one of the articles I wrote, and I have all of that information for you. So Anybody in the classroom, go ahead, and in the chat room, go ahead and put anything in. And Josh and Cindy, go ahead. What things you thinking?
Well, I think this would be a fun way to teach. Why would you want to teach any other way? Why would you want to teach the other way where you start out with the boring information and try to get kids engaged? And it's even less planning time for you. If you have the structure and you know the types of questions that you're going to help kids guide, you don't have to do that much work. So I think of it as a fun way to approach teaching.
Exactly. It really, Cindy, you're right, because it's a lot more fun. I'll tell you what, if you've ever taught seniors at 7 o'clock in the morning and you ask a question, most of them aren't even awake yet.
Yeah.
And so it is so true that it really engages the kids, because I don't know how many people out there were wondering, what is this all about? Laura states here, I can see how it's used in all sorts of classes, social studies, art, science. Steve said it really fits with a Socratic seminar, which is so true. Jane talks about how it really can lead into blended learning. Chris has mentioned that it really takes those tech tools and it integrates it into other content. And it was kind of interesting. Jane just said, I kind of recognize Wilson's face now. And so what we're doing is we're all involved in the process. Josh, any thoughts you have there?
These are all great comments, great thoughts. As a former social studies teacher, loved working off political cartoons and engaging history, but obviously it can be used in multiple content areas. Another reflection I had is part of having just finished my PhD, one of my biggest reflections on what that process taught me is about questioning. I mean, that's really where you're pressed into thinking about asking good questions, the right questions, and formulating things as you go through that process. And I'm thinking, what a great opportunity to engage students at an earlier point in their academic career, not going back to the graph that you showed at the very beginning, where their quality of questions declines through their academic experience. I certainly can reflect upon that being probably accurate for myself. It went back up in my PhD process, but roughly 1% of the population goes through a process like that. So what a great opportunity to teach our students at an earlier age and more proactively in their academic process to be great questioners and to look at how to utilize great questions to influence their learning. So that was my takeaway from that section, Mike.
Well, you can see how this fits into makers and STEM, also how it fits into the ASK program, because wow, what happens when we apply this to that whole ASK program on careers, and kids are questioning careers and what type of questions do they have and those types of things. So it also really fits in, it just fits into everywhere, and it fits into our everyday life.
Yes.
How many times do you go to something and you go to the doctor, or you go buy a car, or whatever, and you say, you know something, what type of questions do I have? And sometimes it's really good to formulate those ahead of time. Cindy, I think you were going to say something, or?
Well, I also feel like if you're teaching kids how to question, when they get that first job, when they get out in the work world, one of the things that we have heard from employers is they just don't ask any questions. They don't learn. They don't want to learn. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just they don't know how to ask the questions.
So I'm going to take you a step further. Cindy, what are they waiting for?
Yeah. They're waiting, right. And so often employers will say, they're just waiting to be told what to do.
Exactly, because that's what we've trained them to do since kindergarten.
Yeah. And they don't want that. They want kids that will ask questions and will, be more assertive more active in the process. So this is also teaching kids lifelong skills, like you said, and skills that the workplace will appreciate.
I think the other thing, as you think about this too, is I love this because any teacher can do it. You do not have to be a technology. So many things everything's technology, everything's technology. No. Everything should be about learning. And it should be about the authentic learning process and kids owning it. And then how do we use technology to amplify that? And that's what we're going to talk about in part 2. So the only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. Maybe you have a little better understanding of that one now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We learn more by looking for the answer to the question and not finding it than we do from learning the answer itself. Wow. It's all part of education. It's all part of the learning process. Laura says here, you can easily put a time so you can stay within your class restraints. You might even get kids thinking about the topic beyond your class. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's great, Laura. That's a great thing that you said there. And so what's coming soon? Webinar 2, Asking the Right Question, Part 2. Free resources. We're going to talk about getting digital with this, how to do it in Zoom, how to do it with Google Docs, and there's so much more. And if you really, really like this stuff, we're actually going to have something this fall where we're going to do a book study with it, and we're going to actually have you write some lessons. We're going to supply the books for free, all that type of stuff. We're going to help you write those lessons, and we hope you're part of the, and you can get some points, some certification points for doing it too. So we've got that coming for you later in the fall, but part 2 is coming up for you pretty soon here. So where to go on the reflection? It's importance of student-owned inquiry. That is so important. Using a process or a protocol is so important. Protocols do work with students, okay? If you look at any of the national school reform protocols, whether it be critical friends, whatever, it works. Connecting subjects. It connects subjects. Not only do we connect subjects, but we can connect them to the real world. It helps with their research skill facilitation. Remember that Stanford study I just talked about. And it emphasizes the question, because kids don't emphasize the question because we don't. We tend to always emphasize the answer. And so where to get things more, you can go to my blog at 21st Century Ed Tech. In fact, the actual URL under there, I'll leave that on for just a second, will take you to the actual page with all the resources. But now next time, we're going to even get you more into it. I'm even going to give you a template you can use with your students. So think about that. So there's one place you can go. That's at my blog at 21st Century Ed Tech. We're also going to have it at our actual Makerspace site here at Indiana, makerspace.weebly.com. And all you have to do is click on the online PD. And so another great place to go. And I'll tell you what, you go to this site, you're going to find so many more things. And we're really starting to get into this blended learning environment. We have so many workshops coming this fall for you, all of them free. Some of them are going to give you books. Some of them are going to give you equipment. It's all going to be free for you too. And we're really, really excited about that. And from there, Josh, I'm going to turn it back over to you and Cindy. You can talk a little bit about where it is on your site and kind of bookend this up with us.
Sure, thanks, Mike. I thought I was excited about Top Gun 2 coming out, but I might be more excited about part 2 of your session, Mike. You've really set the table there for people to come back and make sure they get some more, some great information on how to really take this to the next level. So again, as Mike referenced, some great resources there that he talked about. The Region 8 website at r8esc.k12.in.us. Right there under there, you can see there on your screen, there's a drop-down menu under professional development. You'll see one of the sub-menus there is online learning. You'll see all of our online learning opportunities there. Again, as Mike mentioned, for free as well. And again, they're free because the Schwab Foundation has so graciously supported this and many other efforts that we're doing with the Makerspace team as well as the Ask team. And so again, very grateful for that. So please check out one of those resource sites that Mike has mentioned, as well as the Region 8 website for even more online pieces there. Again, I want to reemphasize the makerspace.weebly site that Mike previously had mentioned. Thank you, Mike, for bringing this information today, courtesy of the Right Question Institute. If you are watching online and want to reach out to Mike about this or any of the topics that Mike has presented on, you can see his email address there at the bottom of the screen. Also really want to thank the contributors to this who are currently off camera right now, and we had referenced them throughout the presentation. Jane Gorman, Chris Riley, Laura Smith, Barb Cisco, and Steve Debker, who are all contributors to this effort and this initiative. Mike is a national speaker and advocate and a champion of these topics and champion of quality instruction in classrooms to positively impact student learning so that we can all better prepare our students for a bright and better future. And so really grateful for Mike's time today. Cindy, I'll just want to make sure that any closing comments or questions before we sign off.
No, I'm also looking forward to part 2 and how teachers who maybe have mandated curriculum that they feel like they have to address, how do they shift and open up their minds to approaching it from a question-based format? So I'm excited to hear what Mike has to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Cindy. And any closing comments or thoughts, Mike, before we sign off?
As you can tell, I'm just excited about anything that gets our kids to own their learning, because that's where true engagement and authentic learning comes from, whether it be STEM, whether it be PBL, whether it be looking at their careers, all of these types of things. So thank you so much for joining me. I want you here next time for that part 2. And if you can't somehow, we will have it posted on all of those sites again. And then also, we will have some information coming up to you. In fact, if you want, you can email me, and if you want to be on our mailing list for when we start to put out these ones that you can get the credit for, you can actually get the free books and all that type of stuff. Feel free to send me an email and ask for that, and I'll make sure we put you on our mailing list. So, hey, Josh, Chris, thank you, Cindy, thank you so much. This has been great. I enjoy learning with all of you. Have a great, great day.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to everyone out there. And hey, catch us next time for part 2. Thanks, everybody.